leave an old life behind in search of a brighter future. In 1910, 3 out of 4 black Americans lived on farms, and 9 out of 10 lived in the South. That is 7 million out of 8 million people. Between 1910 and 1925, about 8,000 members of this group moved north. By 1970, 7 million African Americans had moved north. The people packed up and moved. Now, the quality of life in the South included several factors that precipitated this mass movement. Number one, the boll weevil had moved across the South, decimating the cotton crops. King Cotton had been brought to its knees. Number two, World War I. Blacks had fought in that war, sustained significantly a higher proportion of loss of life, and came home to find that they were not going to be rewarded for their sacrifices, but still be subjected to an inferior quality of life. In fact, 10 out of 70 lynchings in 1919 were African American soldiers, some of them still in uniform. The people packed up and moved north. Due to World War I, the price of food increased. The people packed up and moved north. Also due to World War I, European immigration had been halted. Now, this immigration had been going on for over 60 years. As you well will remember, there was a great loss of white life during the Civil War. So immigration had been in full steam. But with World War I commencing, there was a need for more labor. And there was a labor shortage. Immigration had been halted. Some white men had gone to fight later on after 1917. But more importantly, earlier than 1917, there was an economic boom. War materials were being produced, shipment overseas. There was a need for labor to produce those arms and supplies. The blacks packed up and moved north. The South had fewer schools and a lower literacy rate. You went to school when you were not needed in the fields. There were also poor basic services. We all have heard the stories from our grandparents and great-grandparents about outdoor plumbing, and definitely that was the case in the black community. The people packed up and moved north. Southern workers were grossly underpaid, generally about 2/3 of the rate as elsewhere in the country. For example, in Alabama, a foundry worker made $2.50 for a 10-hour workday, while in Illinois, the rate was $4.25. The southern region was more of a colony, exporting raw materials. The workers, black and white, were trapped. The political climate in the South was also deteriorating. Reconstruction was over. Between 1890 and 1910, most African Americans were disenfranchised. They lost the right to vote. How? There were restrictive requirements for eligibility. You had to own so much property, or there were poll taxes, there were literacy tests, and the one that's my favorite, the grandfather clause. This clause limited the vote to those whose grandfathers were registered voters. Therefore, blacks were disqualified since they had only received the right to vote in 1870 with the 15th Amendment. So, of course, their grandfathers were not voting, they were slaves. Now, these poor quality of life factors in the the South were compared to the hopes and expectations for life in the North. Number one, there will be more freedom and independence. There will be better wages. There will be educational opportunities for the children. And maybe I can save some money, and since I really don't want to leave home, I can return home after I save some money. So people packed up and moved north. Now, this decision wasn't made selfishly. They considered, how bad is it here? How bad is it really here? How really bad is it here? Versus, how good is it there? Who in the family will go? How will we take care of those who are left behind? How much money will it take to get there? And where will I live when I get there? Now, there were labor agents recruiting about that time, from 1910 on, because that labor shortage in the North had to be taken care of. These labor agents would ride south and give out train passes. Black newspapers carried job advertisements, the Chicago Defender being one of the prime examples. Railroads were among the first to recruit, where they needed workers to transport the war materials and maintain the rail lines. Young men between 18 and 34 were the first to go. Dad may have been a sharecropper. He needed to get in his share of that crop. He was also responsible for the rest of the family. We can let you slip away. Or maybe you had a young family and you can go north, leave that young family with your parents, get established, and then send for that family. Most of these young men headed to large industrial cities such as Detroit, Pittsburgh, New York, and Chicago. They traveled by train, boat, bus, car, even horse-drawn car. Churches formed migration clubs to provide information and aid in this migration. And if you look at the old train routes, you can easily determine where folks were headed. Up the eastern seaboard, from the Carolinas to Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York. Up from Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia to Chicago. In later years of the migration wave, they would go out west to California. High expectations and hopes for life in the North. Immediately upon arrival, there was one major problem: housing. Upon arrival, migrants lived with other family members, rented a room, an apartment, maybe a row house if lucky, depending on the city and their circumstances. My grandfather, John, would always talk about those country people when it came to the city, because he was a city slave. And he said they slept 3 deep. Someone slept during the day because they worked the night shift. Someone slept at night because they worked the day shift. And if there were no more beds, someone slept in the bathtub. Access to housing was a major problem. Some cities adopted residential segregation ordinances, but in 1917, the Supreme Court declared them unconstitutional. So restrictive covenants were used. Now these are formal deed restrictions. So for example, in my neighborhood here in Columbus, you are not allowed to have a clothesline. No clothesline. In white neighborhoods, these formal deed restrictions were used, and if broken, the whites could be sued by their damaged neighbors because you have lowered my property value. This led to all black neighborhoods, cities within cities, commonly referred to now as ghettos. Overcrowding because of scarcity of housing, poverty, and poor access to medical treatment. Because, of course, the black physicians and hospitals were also segregated. But the people packed up and they moved north. Now, the second problem these African American migrants experienced when they moved north was finding a job, work. Now you have to remember that 25 million Europeans had entered the country between 1871 and 1915. 12 million immigrants passed through Ellis Island alone between 1892 and 1924. Their descendants, in fact, represent about 50% of the current U.S. population. After 1900, Europeans were arriving at a rate of 1 million per year. By 1910, the foreign-born made up a quarter of the nation's workforce. In some industries, such as mining, clothing factories, steel mills, slaughterhouses, they were the majority. Many of the African American migrants were not agricultural workers, but skilled tradesmen, carpenters, bricklayers. These skilled craftsmen were often banned from jobs by company policy, union regulations, or white-only tradition. Many were forced to take lower-paid menial jobs. But the people packed up and moved north. Some, like those from the steel towns of Alabama, Birmingham, Bessemer, headed to the coal fields of Kentucky, West Virginia, and Pennsylvania, where they fared better in terms of pay. African American migrants were in competition with established communities of Europeans and their descendants for work at many times. Pay in the South was so low that migrants would work for less than the going rate in the North. This caused friction. Labor unions were overwhelmed with the surplus labor. Employers operated as though the unions did not exist. The use of scab labor, strike busters, was for a 48 to 60-hour work week. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reported in 1919 that a family of 5 needed $43 per week. This, coupled with the high cost of food and lodging in the North, forced black women into the workplace. And the third major problem faced by the African American as he or she moved north was isolation. The black elite distanced themselves from the new arrivals because the new arrivals lacked education and brought their rural backgrounds with them. This led to the formation of social clubs and the establishment of many storefront churches. These churches became the cornerstone of the community. And the people packed up their bags and moved north. Much of this temple talk was taken from websites that are readily available: In Motion, AAME, Digital History, as well as the book To Make Our World Anew, A History of African Americans by Robin Kelly and Earl Lewis. I invite you to continue to pack up your bag and move north when opportunity